Right, so let's get started. So with rounding, there's two types of rounding scenarios that you're going to encounter. The first one is what I'm covering in this video today, which is where at the end of the question, when it asks you to give the answer, it asks for you to round at that point. So, for example, it'll give you a question, let's say it's on infusion rates, and they'll ask you to calculate, let's say, for example, the infusion rate over 24 hours. And then it will say round your answer to, and that's where it will say, for example, to 2 decimal places, 1 decimal place, or give your answer to the nearest whole number. But basically, the point I'm getting at is at the end of the question, it will state what it wants you to do. There's another scenario where you may be asked to round during the question, and that comes under quantity to supply, which I'll talk a little bit about at the end of this video, but it's not what I'm going to be covering today. That's something which I'm going to be covering in my workbooks on quantity to supply, because it's a completely different way of tackling rounding. So let's get started with the scenario for part 1, which is where we have to round our answer right at the end of the question once we've calculated our answer. So that, first of all, can be broken down into 2 ways. And this is what I need you to understand if you've come here for help with rounding. So the first way is where they can ask you to round it to a specific set of decimal places. So to a specific set of decimal places. What does that mean? So what that means is, for example, at the end of the question, they say to you, round your answer to 1 decimal place, round your answer to 2 decimal places, round your answer to 3 decimal places. So the point is that they want the answer to a specific set of decimal places. So I want you to, whenever you do an exam question, and at the end, I want you to first of all put it into one of these 2 categories. Is it asking me to round it into a specific set of decimal places? Or is it using the wording give your answer or round your answer to the nearest? And then it will give a value or a range it wants it in. So it might say give your answer to the nearest pound, give your answer to the nearest whole number, give your answer to the nearest 10, give your answer to the nearest 100. So again, when you're doing a calculation question and you've got your answer at the end, you need to double check, what is it wanting me to do? Is it asking for the answer to a set of specific decimal places, or is it asking it to the nearest something? And depending on which one you get out of these 2, you either get option A or option B. You're going to have to decide which route to take. So let's start with option A, which is to, if question's asking us to round to a specific set of decimal places. So the one I'm going to start off with first is rounding to 1 decimal place. The first thing I want you to understand is where is the decimal place? Because in order for you to be able to understand how to round to a decimal place, you need to know where it is. So when it's referring to 1 decimal place, I'll just get a red pen. It's referring to the first place after the decimal. So that here is the first place after the decimal. Now, when you have to round to 1 decimal place, what you should always do is find the first decimal place. If you're rounding to 1 decimal place, put an arrow underneath where the first decimal place is. So if you've seen any of my workbook calculation videos, you'll realize that in every single question I do, if I have to round, I always draw a little box around the place where it wants me to do a specific decimal place, and I'll put an arrow there. Once I've done that, I'll look at the number to the right of it. So I'm rounding to 1 decimal place, so I'll put a little arrow and a box around the one it's referring to, and I look at the number to the right of it. And I say, is that number 5 or more? So is it greater than 5 or equal to 5, or is it less than 5? So what am I doing? I'm looking at this number 8, the one that's next to the 1 decimal place. So I'm just going to highlight that for you. I'm looking at the number 8 and I'm saying, is that number 8 5 or more, or is it less than 5? Well, it's bigger than 5 is 8. So what you do is you round it up. You add 1 to this number, the 1 in the decimal place. So you do 4 add 1 is 5. So your answer is going to become 0.5. So let's go over that again. Let's break it down a little bit wider. We've got 0.48. The question wants us to round to 1 decimal place, which is this number here. It wants us to round to 1 decimal place. It's the first one after the decimal. So what do? We look at the number to the right of that, just the one number, and we say, is it bigger than 5 or is it smaller than 5? Well, it's bigger than 5. So what are we going to do? We're going to round up. We're going to add 1 to the 1 decimal place, and it's going to become 0.5. So it doesn't really matter how many numbers you've got in a string. So let's look at the second example. What do I mean by that? We've got 25.44. Let's say we had 25.4455555555, and the question wants us to round to 1 decimal place. Forget everything you've got in that string. Just look at the first decimal place. So I want you to look at the 4 there, draw your little arrow because that's the first decimal place, and I want you to look at the number to the right of it, the first number that comes on the right, and it's a 4. And you say to yourself, is it greater than 5? Is it 5 or more, or is it less than 5? Well, this number's less than 5, so we're going to round down, and when we round down, we cross that number out and we just leave it as it is. So the answer for this one would be 25.4. So again, I'm going to explain this again. I'm going to write it out a little bit bigger for you. So we've got 25.44, okay? And the question wants you to round it to 1 decimal place. So what I want you to do is just draw a box around the position it's referring to. So it's referring to this position, the 1 decimal place. You look at the first number next to it and you say, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5, cross it out. That's your answer, 25.4. And it doesn't matter what the units are when you're doing your rounding to decimal places. So whatever units you're dealing with, let's say for example I had 25.44 mils here. If that was 25.44 grams, if that was in milligrams, if that was in percentage, if that was in mils per hour for infusion rate, it doesn't matter. When you're rounding to a specific set of decimal places, like in this scenario to 1 decimal place, I want you to forget everything else that's there and just focus on getting this part right. Find where is the 1 decimal place in the question. I want you to find that, and then I would just want you to look at the first number to the right and say, right, is it greater than 5 or is it less than 5? If it falls bam smack on 5, we say 5 or more, we round up. Let's have a look at the next example. So I've deliberately put different units on here. I've put grams, I've put percentages, I've put litres. I've put millimolars per hour. It doesn't matter what units you've got. If you want to put it to 1 decimal place, what are you interested in? You're just interested in finding the 1 decimal place, which is here, the 7. Draw a little arrow underneath it. Look to the right and say, that's number 2. Is 2 greater than 5 or less than 5? It's less than 5. So I'm going to cross it out, and my answer would be 42.7 grams. I should have put units, I suppose, just for the sake of argument. I'll do that now. So again, let's have a look at this. We've got 42.72 grams, and we want to round to 1 decimal place. All you have to do is find your 1 decimal place position, look to the right, and say, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's that number 2 is smaller than 5. So what are you going to do? You're going to cross it out, and your answer is 42.7. Let's look at the next example. we've got 0.104%. I'm going to write it over here for you, just a little bit bigger, 0.104%. And we want to round this to 1 decimal place. Find where is the 1 decimal place position. What are they referring to? They're referring to that position there where the 1 is. It's after the decimal place. You look at the number to the right, ignore the 4, ignore everything else that comes there. You're not bothered. You're just looking at the one that's to the right of the 1 decimal place. Is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5. So what are you going to do? You're going to cross it out, and that's your answer, 0.1%, the units. Let's take a look at the next one. We've got 0.3375 litres. What we're going to do, we want to round it to 1 decimal place. We're going to find a 1 decimal place position, which is this 3 here. You look to the number to the right of it, which is a 3, and you say, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5. So what you're going to do, you're going to cross out the 3, and your answer is going to be 0.3 litres. Again, let me just write that out a little bit clearer for you. There you go. And let's have a look. Again, we want to round this to 1 decimal place. So what did we do? We found a 1 decimal place position. We drew a box around it. We looked at the number to the right. We said, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5, so we're going to cross it out. That's our answer, 0.3 litres. Let's have a look at the next one. We've got 5.217 millimolar per hour. We want to round this to 1 decimal place. I'm going to write it out a little bit bigger over here. 5.217 millimolar per hour. So what are you going to do? You're going to find the 1 decimal position first, the first decimal place. Put an arrow there. That's what we're referring to. You look at the number to the right of it. Only that number. Forget the 7. You're not interested. Forget everything else on the calculator. You're just bothered about that number there. And you're saying, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5. So what are you going to do? You're going to cross it out, and your answer is going to remain at 5.2 millimolar per hour. And just repeat this procedure again and again and again. What I'm going to do is, on my Buy Me a Coffee page, I'm going to put up some worksheets for you. If you're struggling with rounding, don't worry. I'm going to put up a page on different questions to do with rounding, and I'd just like you to have a go at them, and the answers will be combined in the same document for you. By the way, these worksheets are also available on there for free to download. So head over if you want to get a copy of the worksheet, if you want to pause it and have a crack at doing those before watching this video. That's not a bad idea either. So let's have a look at the next scenario we've got. We're going to round these following numbers to 2 decimal places. So it falls in category A. It wants a specific set of decimal places. That's what we're talking about here, guys. So what are we going to do? Hopefully you've got the gist of this now. You're going to find where is your second decimal place in this scenario. So after the dot, you go, that's 0's in the first decimal place, number 8's in the second one. So you're going to draw a little arrow, and you're going to box it off. It's a bit difficult for me to do that because the text when it's printed is a bit small, so I'm just going to write it out here for you. 0.0845 grams. So we're going to find where is the second decimal place. There it is. We're going to draw a box around it. We're going to look at the number to the right, and we're going to say, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5. So what you're going to do, you're going to cross it out, and your answer is 0.08. 0.08 grams. Right, so let's have a look at the next one. You've got 0.2275 litres. You're going to find the second decimal place. That's the second decimal place. So after the decimal, that's my first decimal place, that's my second decimal place, that's my third, and that's my fourth. Just going to draw some little lines to show you. So the number 2 here, after the decimal place, is the first location. Number 2 that comes there is in the second decimal place location. Number 7 that comes there is in the third decimal location, because look, 1, first decimal location, second decimal location, third decimal location, and the 5 is in the fourth decimal location, is the 5 there. So we are going to just write this out over here, just so it's a little bit bigger. 0.2275 litres. And we're going to say to ourselves we want to round this to 2 decimal places. Find the second decimal place, put an arrow underneath it, look to the right. Is that number greater than 5 or less than 5? Well, the number 7 is greater than 5. So what are you going to do? You're going to add 1 to that number there. That's going to give you an answer of 0.23 litres. So remember, if it's less than 5, it's a good idea to just cross it out. If it's greater than 5, just put a little +1 on the top to remind yourself and then write out the answer. Let's take a look at the next one. 1.495 millilitres. I'm going to write it out over here. 1.495 millilitres. And the question wants us to round this to 2 decimal places. So we're going to find where is the second decimal place position. There it is. That's our second decimal place position, guys. Is the number 9. So what do? We look to the number to the right of it. If you've got a really big long number in your calculator, forget everything else. The only thing that you're interested in is finding the second decimal place and looking at that number to the right of it. That's all. It's a 5. So if it's 5 or more, you let it soar. That was an old expression that was used when I was at school many moons ago. This to say that if the number is 5 or more, then you round upwards. So you 5 or more, let it soar. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to add 1 here because it's 5 or more. So we round up. So 9 add 1 will make this a 10. And if that becomes a 10, we change this number over here. Because it's just maths basically. Think of it like this. If that was 49, add 1, it becomes 50. So your answer is 1.50 millilitres. So again, let's have a look at this. We were rounding 1.495 here in millilitres. I wrote it out over here, so a little bit bigger. I then found my second decimal place, which was the number 9. I looked to the right of it. That number there is greater, is 5 or more. So I round up. And to round up, I add 1 to this number here, number 9. If I add 1 to 9, I get 10. So I put a 0 there, and I carry forward from my 10 here. And I change this. I add 1 to that number to make it 1.50. So again, an easy way to do it was, like I said, that's 49. I added 1 to it, and it became 50. Let's look at this one. It's a percentage number. Remember, it doesn't matter what the units are. If they're asking you to round to a specific number set of decimal places, the same methodology here applies, the same principle. So they want us to round 29.3456% to 2 decimal places. So you're going to find the second decimal place here. It's the number 4. That's the second decimal place. I'm going to write it here just so you can visually see what I'm saying. Second decimal place. You're going to look at the number to the right of it and you're going to say, is it 5 or more? Yes, it is. So you're going to round up. You're going to add 1 to the 4 to get 29.35. So let's write this out and do this again. So we've got 29.3456%. And they want us to round this answer to 2 decimal places. So we're going to find the second decimal place position that they're referring to, which is the number 4. It's in the second place after that decimal dot. We're going to look to the number to the right and we're going to say, is it 5 or more? Yes, it is. So we're going to round up. We're going to add 1 because we're rounding up, we're going to add 1 to the number that's in the second decimal place position. So that will become a 5. So we've got 29.35. And let's have a look at this last example in the 2 decimal place scenario. So I've given you let's say an infusion rate here, and it's a long-winded number on the calculator in mils per hour, and they want you to round your answer to 2 decimal places. Well, you don't need to panic, you can just follow the same principles as before. Find your second decimal place position, which is the number 9 there. Look at the number to the right of it, that's all you're interested in, and you're going to say, is it 5 or more? Yes it is. Then you're going to round up, you're going to add 1 to this 9 over here. So let's have a look over here, let's write this out a little bit bigger, and let's see how we do. 34.597,459, and it's mils per hour. So you're going to find the second decimal position. There it is. I'm going to draw an arrow there. You're going to look at the number to the right. Is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's greater than 5. So you're going to add 1 to the 9 here. If you add 1 to 59, because I'm looking at these two together, what do you get? You get 60. So your answer is 34.60. Okay? Because you're adding 1. So if you add 9, add 1 is 10. That becomes a 0. Carry 1 forward. Hopefully you've understood that. Right, okay, so this is the second option. This is option B, when I talked about the 2 different styles that you need to be aware of when it comes to rounding. So earlier we looked at rounding to a specific set of decimal places, which was option A. This is option B, where the exam can ask you to round to the nearest. Okay, so these two employ slightly different understandings. So now that we've covered the first way, let's have a look at rounding to the nearest something. So the first one I'm going to deal with is rounding to the nearest whole number, and then we're going to take a look at rounding to the nearest 10, rounding to the nearest 100, rounding to the nearest, let's say, 0.05, rounding to the nearest 0.1. So they're all to the nearest scenarios. Okay? So the first thing I want you to understand is when you're rounding to the nearest whole number, what is a whole number? So ignore this part. Sorry, apologies underneath here. If I could cover it up, it would have been a bit better perhaps. Give me 1 sec. Let's do this. Here's one I made earlier. There we go. Right, okay. So rounding to the nearest whole number. The first thing I want to discuss with you is what is a whole number. No matter how silly that statement might just sound, it's really important that you understand this. What is a whole number? So a whole number is the number in front of the decimal place. So for example, we know that, look, the number 1 is a whole number. The number 2 is a whole number. The number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. When we're dealing with pharmacy calculations and we refer to a whole number, that's what we're referring to. So you could then say, well, 1 can be written as 1.0, 2 can be written as 2.0, and the whole number position is that position there. So if I have a string of numbers and I have 23.596 and I said to you, where is the whole number position? That's the position there in front of the decimal place that we're talking about, the whole number position. So again, if you had 1.6978, 10, and I said to you, or the exam said to you, round to the nearest whole number, what number are they referring to in this sequence? They're referring to that position there. That's the whole number position. Okay, so that's the first thing for you to understand and get your head round. Now let's have a look at this here in these statements I've written under whole number. when we're dealing with rounding to the nearest whole number, they may ask you to round to the nearest whole mil, to the nearest whole gram, to the nearest whole milligram, to the nearest whole pound. At this point in time, when I'm going to talk about rounding, and in the exam when we talk about dealing with rounding situations, what you should be focusing on is not the units, because you should have calculated your answer in the correct units that the question wants. I'm assuming that you've already done that, okay? If you haven't, you need to convert it to the correct units that the answer wants. The point is that when you come to round it, that's the bit you're interested in, because you've already identified that we're dealing with this bit in the question, the nearest. Okay, so the first thing you will have identified is, are they asking me to do option A, a specific number of decimal places, or is it option B, to the nearest something? So it's option B. Then you're going to look at this part here. They're asking me to round to a whole number. And when we deal with a whole number, this is how we deal with it. Let's have a look. So we've got 109.8%. So just like before, what I want you to do is I want you to find the whole number position. So if you have a look here and I said to you draw an arrow where the whole number position is, it's that position there, number 9. That's the whole number position. And what you're going to do is, again, just like before, you're going to look to the right, to the first number on its right, which is always going to be the first number after the decimal. And you're going to say, is it greater than 5 or is it less than 5? Well, 8 is greater than 5. In mathematics, they can draw this little arrow with a 5 next to it, meaning it's greater than 5. That's all that means. You don't have to do that. I apologise. I shouldn't really start doing things like that, should I? So 8 is greater than 5. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to add 1 to the whole number position, to the number 9. And if 9 add 1 gives you 10. So your answer here is 110%. So let's have a look at that again. I'm going to write out the question. 109.8%. And they want you to round it to the nearest whole number. So what you should be doing is you should be drawing a box around where the whole number position is. It's the first number in front of the decimal. And then you should be saying, I'm going to look to the number to the right of it, and I'm going to say, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, it's greater than 5, so I'm going to round up. I'm going to add 1 to this number here in the whole number position. 9 add 1 is 10, so it becomes 110%. Let's have a look at the next one. 756.293 milliliters. They want you to round it to the nearest whole to the nearest whole milliliter. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to look for the whole number position, which is that number there, the number 6. You're going to look to the number to the right of it, and you're going to say, is it greater or smaller than 5? In this scenario, it's smaller than 5, so you cross it out, and then that's your answer. So here, I'm going to write it out, the question, 756.293 milliliters. We're going to isolate where is the whole number position, that there. We're going to look to the right, and we're going to say, is that number greater than 5 or less than 5? It's less than 5, so we cross it out. We're not interested in anything else. We've crossed it out. That's our answer. So it's 756 mil. Let's work through these now. Now this one, I've deliberately jumbled the numbers up for you. So I've taken the question that we just did and jumbled the numbers up, and I'll show you why. You want to round this number to the nearest whole number. So you're going to isolate which is my whole number position. It's the number 6. I'm going to look to the number to the right. This time it's greater than 5, isn't it? Last time it was less than 5. So because it's greater than 5, what you're going to do, you're going to round up, you're going to add 1. So you should have got 757 milliliters. So let's have a look how I got to that answer. It's 756.923 milliliters. we want to round it to the nearest whole milliliter. So we're going to isolate where is the whole number position. It's the 6. We're going to look to the number to the right. It's greater than 5. So what are we going to do? We're going to add 1 to the 6. And that gives you 757 mil. Let's have a look at the next one. We've got 1,848.96 grams. We want to round to the nearest whole milligram. So you're going to isolate where's your whole number. It's number 8. You're going to look to the number to the right of it, and it's a 9. So what you're going to do, it's greater than 5. You're going to round up. So you should have got an answer of 1849 milligrams. Let's have a look. I'll write it out a little bit clearer. 1848.96 milligram. We're going to isolate where is our whole number position, because they want it to the nearest whole milligram. There. We're going to look to the number to the right, and we're going to say, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's greater than 5, so we're going to add 1 to the whole number position. The next one, I've given you mils per hour, 76.19 mils per hour. Again, don't be confused by the mils per hour when you're rounding. It doesn't bear a relevance. You've already calculated your answer. You should have your answer in the correct units that the question wants. Again, if you've worked through my workbooks, we pay a lot of emphasis to this. So if you haven't, let me just give you some advice now. Before you start doing any rounding at the end of a question, if the question says to you it wants the answer rounded at the end, please make sure that you've already got your answer in the correct units that the question wants. So let's have a look at this scenario. We want to round to the nearest milliliter per hour. Okay, so we're going to isolate our whole number. It's a 6. We're going to look at the number to the right of it. It's a 1. The 1, is it bigger than 5 or less than 5? It's less than 5. So we're going to cross out the 1, and we're just going to leave it at 76. We ignore the 9. We're not interested. What are we interested in? We're interested in the number to the right of the whole number, what we're looking at. So this answer here is 76 milliliters per hour. Let's go to the next one. We've calculated, let's say, how much powder we need, let's say over here, and on our calculator we've got this big long string of numbers, and they want the answer to the nearest gram. Okay, to the nearest whole gram. So what are you going to do? You're going to isolate where's my whole number there. You're going to look at the number next to it. It's a 2, and you're going to say to yourself, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5. So what am I going to do? I'm going to cross it out. I'm not interested. My answer is 76 grams. Let's look at the next one. £153.82, and they'd like the answer to the nearest whole pound. Yep. What are we going to do? Well, I'll write it out a little bit clearer for you here, and a bit bigger, so that we can tackle it together. We're going to say the nearest whole pound, well, that's the whole number there. I'm going to look to the number to the right of it. It's an 8. Is it bigger than 5, equal to 5, or smaller than 5? It's bigger than 5. So what am I going to do? I'm going to round up, and I'm going to add 1 to the whole number here. So that gives me an answer of £154. Let's look at the next scenario. We've got £153.49. We're going to isolate where our whole number is, because they want the answer rounded to the nearest whole pound. We're going to look at the number to the right of it. It's a 4. We're going to say to ourselves, is it 5 or more? So is it bigger than 5? No, it's smaller than 5. So what are we going to do? We're going to cross it out. We're not interested. We're going to leave it at £153. Let's look at the last one. We've got 14.3487. It's just a number. They want us to round it to the nearest whole number. So what do? You isolate where is your nearest whole number. It's the number 4. You draw a little line under the number to the right of it and say to yourself, is it 5 or more? So is it bigger than 5 or equal to 5? Or is it smaller than 5? Well, it's smaller than 5. So you're not interested. So you leave it at 14. That's rounding to the nearest whole number, guys. So hopefully what you're going to take away from this situation is, first of all, we isolate. Does it want it option A to a specific set of decimal places, or does it want option B where it's referring to the nearest something? If it's referring to the nearest something, then we're going to go in and we're going to work through, if it's a whole number, we're going to isolate where that position is, and then we just follow through on this methodology. Rounding to the nearest 5. So the first thing I want to talk about for situations where we have to round to the nearest 5, notice it says nearest. So again, I'm going to mention this, that this is in our option B when I talked about the two different types of rounding situations that we're going to encounter when they ask us to round at the end of the question. They might ask us to round to the nearest number. So this is what that's relating to the nearest 5. So the first thing I want you to understand is when you're rounding to the nearest 5, your options are going to be 0, 5, or a 10. Okay, so that's the first thing I want you to understand, that if you've got a number, so we'll start off simple and we'll start off with our number line over here. So let's say you've got the numbers 1 right through to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you've got 10. Okay, when you have to round to the nearest 5, what you're really doing is you're looking at the number of the whole number position, so which is the number before the decimal dot. But for the time being, what we'll do is we'll just say, let's look at these numbers. When you have to round any of these whole numbers to the nearest 5, it's going to fall into one of these boxes over here. Okay, we're going to either round it down to 0, we're going to either leave it at 5, or we're going to round it up to 10. So to understand that, what you need to do is you need to kind of visualize this in your head. You've got 3 boxes. You've got 0 to 5, you've got the number 5, and you've got 5 to 10. Okay, so depending on what your number is, it's going to slot into one of these boxes. So I'll just explain that. So 0 to 5, we're going to say these numbers right up till you get to the number 5 is one box. Then you've got the number 5 in its box on its own. And then after 5, you've got the numbers right through to 10. And what you need to say is, if I had the number 1, 2, 3 and 4, and I was told to round any of these 4 numbers to the nearest 5, what I would do is I would think about this box here, 0 to 5. And I would say to myself that what is the midpoint number in 0 to 5? So what's the middle between 0 and 5? Well, it's 2.5. That's the middle number between 0 and 5. So you would say the number 1 falls less than 2.5. So that's going to be rounded down to 0. The number 2 is less than 2.5, so that's going to be rounded down to 0. The number 3 is greater than 2.5, so it's going to be rounded up to 5. The number 4 is greater than 2.5, so it's going to be rounded up to 5. So what we're really doing is we're kind of saying to ourselves that, look, if it's a 1 or a 2, I'll just draw a box for you here. If it's 1 or a 2, you're going to round it to the number 0. Okay? If it's the number 3, 4 or 5, because 5 rounded to the nearest 5 is just 5. You can't move 5 anywhere else. So if it's a 3, 4 or a 5, we're going to round it to the number 5. So let's have a look at that. Let's start with just these here. So the number 1 is going to fall on this side. It's going to be rounded to 0. The number 2 is going to fall on this side because it's less than the midpoint, less than halfway between 0 and 5, so it's going to fall on this side, and these numbers are going to be rounded to 0. If we've got the numbers 3, 4 and 5, we're going to round them to 5 because they're greater than 2.5. Now let's look at the numbers 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. So the midpoint between 5 and 10 is 7.5. So what we say is that the number 6 falls less than 7.5. So it's going to be rounded down to 5. So 6 falls on this side. Same with the number 7. The number 7 is less than 7.5, the midpoint, so it's going to be rounded down to the number 5. When we've got the numbers 8, 9 and 10, they would fall on this side, 8, 9 and 10, because 8, 9 and 10 are greater than 7.5, so we would round these up to 10. So what I'll do is I'll write down here round up to 10. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you some examples. So if I said to you, round the number 3 to the nearest 5, the answer would be 5. Because 3 falls into the box between 0 and 5, and it's greater than the midpoint, where the halfway marker is. So you've got a choice really. You can either just learn this box over here for rounding to the nearest 5, or you can try and actually understand what's going on over here in terms of the methodology and just start slotting them in. Whichever works for you is perfectly fine. So let's say I've got the number 14 and I say round it to the nearest 5. Well, what you do is you first of all box off the units number. That's the first thing you need to be doing. You need to be boxing off the units number and drawing an arrow and saying, right, which number am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about this number over here when I'm rounding to the nearest 5. And then you say, is it greater? So is it going to fall in between 0 and 5? Or is it going to fall in between 5 and 10? Well, it's going to fall in this category, 0 and 5. So then you say, is it greater than the midpoint or less than the midpoint? So is it greater than 2.5 or less than 2.5? It's greater than 2.5, so I'm going to round it up, so my answer is 15. So 14 rounded to the nearest 5 is 15, because remember, we're rounding to the nearest 5s, and what are the 5s? 0, 5 and 10. So if I've got number 18, and I said to you, round to the nearest 5, you need to first of all isolate which number it is in there that we're referring to when we say nearest 5. So it's the units number there, the number 8. And you then say which one is it going to slot into? Well, it's going to slot into between 5 and 10. And the number 8 between 5 and 10 falls on this side. It's greater than the midpoint, 7.5. So our answer goes towards the 10. So if you take the 8 up to 10, you've got to add 1 here to the 10's number, because we've increased. So our answer is 20. Again, let's just have another look at this. So we said we've got the number 18 and we want to round it to the nearest 5. So we isolated and boxed off what we were talking about and referring to, which is the unit number 8 here. We then said the unit number 8, which one does it fall into? So it falls into between 5 and 10. And is it greater than the midpoint between 5 and 10, the middle number? Yes, it is. So we round it up to 10. So if you're going to round it up to 10, the 18 becomes a 20. over here. Now let's look at the examples that I gave you. So the first thing I just want to do before we look at the examples, which is a good thing to mention, is when the exam question asks you at the end, very end, say round it to the nearest 5, regardless of what the units are, 5 mil to the nearest 5 mil, nearest 5 grams, nearest 5 milligrams, nearest 5 micrograms, nearest 5 pound, nearest 5 minutes, your same philosophy is going to apply, the same methodology is going to apply in these situations, guys, okay? You're going to follow this principle, hopefully. Remember, in your exam, you should have already calculated the units that the question's asking you for. So if the question's asking you for the answer in milligrams, you want to convert your answer to milligrams first before you start doing any rounding up to give your final answer. Very, very important. So now let's look at these examples that were shared with you to have a go at. So let's scroll this up. So we're going to round the following numbers to the nearest 5. So we've been asked to round 94 mils to the nearest 5 mil. Okay? So to round it to the nearest 5 mil, what are you going to do? First of all, you're going to isolate what it is we're referring to when we say the nearest 5 mil. It's the units number. It's the number 4. So we say to ourselves, okay, it's the number 4. So does the number 4, is it closer to 0 or is it closer to 5? The number 4. Well, the number 4 is actually closer to the number 5, isn't it? Because remember, your midpoint is 2.5. So this answer is going to be 95 milliliters. Again, let's have a look at the next question. We've got 71 milliliters. Okay, so we want to round it to the nearest 5. So we're going to look at the units number here, the number 1, and we're going to say it falls in between 0 and 5, our range of when we're rounding to the nearest 5. And we're going to say, is 1 closer to 0 or is it closer to 5? Well, the number 1 is actually closer to 0. So we're going to round it to 70 milliliters, and so on. So I think hopefully you're kind of getting a gist of this. You've got 56 milliliters. You're going to isolate to the nearest 5. What are we talking about? We're talking about the number 6 there. So we're going to look between the position 5 and the position 10. That's where you're looking. So when you're looking between the position 5 and 10, you're saying to yourself, is 6 closer to 5 or is it closer to 10? Well, the midpoint is 7.5. So 6 is less than 7.5, so you're going to take it back to the 5. So 56 milliliters is going to become 55 milliliters to the nearest 5. Right, so again, rounding to the nearest 5. So this question I've had to re-record. Thankful to Tahir with a good spot. I actually recorded this wrong the first time round, so many thanks to her. So let's take a look. So when dealing with decimal places, what you need to be aware of is, although we're rounding to the nearest 5 and we're looking at the unit number here, the 7, when you're dealing with decimal places, you must take into account the number that's in the first decimal place slot. So let's write this out a little bit clearer. So we've got 97.5 mil, and we've been asked to round this to the nearest 5 mil. Well, for decimal number places, you're going to have to look at your unit number here, 7, but you must group it with the first number after the decimal. So we're actually looking at 7.5, and we want to round 7.5 to the nearest 5 mil. So again, we'll bring out our little range over here, and we'll say to ourselves, I'll just scroll this up a bit. We'll say to ourselves, where does 7.5 fall? Well, 7.5 falls between the range of 5 and 10. And 7.5 is the midpoint, so you would round up to 10. Therefore, rounding 7.5 up to the nearest 10 will give us here 100 mils. So again, thanks to Tahir for the good spot. When dealing with decimal places, please remember to look at not just the unit number, but look at the first decimal with it and decide where does it fall in your range, so that it'll help you easily to round it up to the nearest 5. Right, so in this next question, we've got 954 milliliters, and we need to round it to the nearest 5. So again, we're going to take a look at the units number because we're rounding to the nearest 5. So that's what we're interested in. And we're going to say, is the number 4 closer to 0 or is it closer to 5? So you've got to remember what your midpoint is between the two, 2.5. So it lies, 4 does, closer on this side. It lies between 2.5 and 5. So we're going to put it in this side and we're going to round it to 5. So this would become 955 milliliters. Now let's take a look at the next one. So we've got 2077 milliliters. So again, rounding to the nearest 5, you should be looking at this number here, which is in the units place, and you need to say to yourself that in the range of 5 to 10, where does 7 lie? Well, your midpoint between 5 and 10, your deciding point, is 7.5. So 7 falls between 5 and 7.5 over here. 7. So you're going to round it down to the 5. That's the closest 5 to the number 7. So your answer is going to become 2075 milliliters. Right, so looking at this next one, rounding to the nearest 5, again, this is a decimal place number. So hopefully what you should be taking into account is when you're rounding to the nearest 5, you're looking at the unit number here. But remember, we said for decimal places, what do we need to do? We need to look at the number next to it. So we're really looking at the 5.5, and that's what's going to really make us decide when we're rounding to the nearest 5, which number is it closer to. So if we've got 435.56 microgram, and we want to round this to the nearest 5, what we're going to do is we're going to box off our 5.5 in the middle there, and we're going to say, what is 5.5 nearer to? Well, if we look on here, and if we look here of our range of 5 to 10, what is 5.5 nearer to? Is it closer to the 5 or is it closer to the 10? Well, 7.5 is the midpoint, so 5.5 falls over here on this side. So it's actually closer to the 5, so we're going to round it to 5. That would give us an answer of 435 micrograms. Let's take a look at the next one. So we've got 598 milligrams, and we want to round it to the nearest 5. So again, we're going to take a look at what number it is that we're talking about. It's the units place here, it's the number 8. And we say, is that 8 closer to 5 or is it closer to 10? Well, that 8 is actually closer to 10 because the midpoint between 5 and 10, remember, is 7.5. So 8 falls on this side, closer to the 10. So what do? We add 1 to the 10's number, to that 9 there. And if you add 1 to that 9, that's going to give you 600 milligrams. Let's take a look at the next one. So this one is a monetary value. It's £2,803. But remember, all we're doing is rounding to the nearest 5. So the units doesn't come into account when we're rounding. It doesn't really play a part. So let's have a look. I'm going to write this out a little bit clearer over here. £2,803. And we're interested in looking at the units number here. And we're saying, is 3 closer to 0 or is it closer to 5? So if you look at your range, if I write down here 0 and I write down 5, and we say, where does 3 fall? Well, the midpoint is 2.5. The middle between 0 and 5 is 2.5. So 3 falls on this side. So we're going to go towards the 5. So that would be rounded up to £2,805. Let's have a look at the next one. So it's a decimal place number again. And remember, when we're rounding to the nearest 5 with decimals, what are we going to do? We're going to box off the unit number and the first decimal. So we've got 9.1 in there. And we're going to say between 5 and 10, because our range is when we're rounding to the nearest 5, and it's 9.1, it's going to fall somewhere between 5 and 10. So the midpoint is 7.5. So where is 9.1 going to fall? It's going to fall on this side, 9.1. So we're going to round it up to the nearest 10. And how do we do that? Well, we add 1 to the tens number. Over here, to the 9. And if we add 1 to the 9, it goes on to the next number. So that will give us an answer of £1,260, rounded to the nearest 5. Let's have a look at the last one. So we've got 116.8 grams. So again, it's a decimal number. So we're going to box off the unit number that we're looking at there with the decimal, 6.8. And we're going to say in our range of 5 to 10, where does 6.8 fall? Well, the easiest thing to do is find your midpoint first, 7.5, and then say where does 6.8 fall? Well, it falls on this side. So we're going to round it down to the 5. That will give us an answer of 115 grams. So again, hopefully what you're taking away from this is when you're dealing with rounding to 5s, the key to remember is the range of 0 to 5 and 5 to 10. And really what you're doing is you're looking at the units number and you're saying, where does it fall? Does it fall between 0 and 5, or does it fall between 5 and 10? And remember where your midpoints are. So you've got 2.5 as your midpoint in there, and you've got 7.5 as your midpoint in there. Right, now let's take a look at rounding to the nearest 10. So if you've just dived into this video and started here, do go back. I'm not going to go through it again, but just to briefly mention that we talked about the 2 different types of rounding when we're asked to do it at the end of a question. So I'm going to assume that you've already been watching all of the video in order. So first of all, to round to the nearest 10, what that's referring to is you've got an option of either going back to 0 or going up to 10. They're the only 2 options you've got. When we rounded to the nearest 5, we had the option of going 0, 5 and 10. When we're rounding to the nearest 10, we've only got the option of going back down to 0 or taking it up to a 10. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. What I mean by that really is, if you've got the number 76 and you're asked to round it to the nearest 10, the first thing that I would always advise you to do is box off the tens number. So what number are we talking about? So that's the tens place, isn't it? 76. That's the tens place. What you do is you look to the number to the right of it here, just like we did when we had a decimal. We look to the number to the right of it and we say, is that number greater than 5, equal to 5 or smaller than 5? And we apply the same rule of rounding that we did in decimals. So we say 6 is greater than 5, so I'm going to round up, and you add 1 to the tens number, making this 80. So let's have a look at another number. We've got 49, and we're asked to round it to the nearest 10. What are we going to do? We're going to box off what is our tens number that we're talking about. We're going to look to the right of it and we're going to say, is it greater than 5, equal to 5 or less than 5? Well, it's greater than 5, so we round up and we add 1 to the tens number, giving us 50 to the nearest 10. So no matter what you've got, let's say I had £3,483 and the calculation question said round it to the nearest 10 pounds, okay? Well, what are you going to do? Well, you're just going to simply find where your tens place is. My tens place is there, isn't it? In the 80 place. And I'm going to look to the number to the right of it. And I'm going to say, is it greater than 5, equal to 5 or less than 5? Well, it's less than 5. So what am I going to do? I'm going to cross it out. Just like we did when we did decimals. I'm going to cross it out and I'm going to say I'm going to round it down to 0. So that gives me an answer of 3480. So really, rounding to the nearest 10 is very, very similar in a sense to decimal places, because what you're doing really is you're isolating where the place is that we're talking about. So the 10th place, which is there, we're looking to the number to the right of it and we're saying, is it greater or smaller than 5? And then we're deciding that if it's 5 or more, we're going to round it up and we're going to add 1. If it's less than 5, then we're just going to cross it out and take it back down to a 0, aren't we? So that's how to round to the nearest 10. Now let's take a look at how you did with the examples. Well, first of all, when you're asked to round to the nearest 10, it doesn't matter what they ask you to round it to in terms of units. 10 pound, 10 grams, 10 kilogram, 10 mils, to the nearest 10 millimolar, to the nearest 10 mils per hour for an infusion. It doesn't really matter as long as you've already converted your units to the correct format that the question wants. So if the question is asking you how many grams of this ointment should you supply and your answer's in milligrams, well, you need to convert it to grams first before you start doing the rounding right at the end of the question. Remember that. So let's have a look. Round these numbers to the nearest 10. Well, when I've got £66.80, all I'm interested in is the tens place here. That's my tens place, isn't it? £60. That's my tens place in there. In the £66.80, how many tens have I got? I've got 6 tens, £60. So I look to the number to the right, and that's a 6. And I say to myself, is that 6 equal to 5, greater than 5, or smaller than 5? Well, it's bigger than 5, isn't it? 6. So what you're going to do, you're going to add 1. You're going to round up the tens position. So that's going to give you an answer of £70. Let's take a look at the next one. We want to round this to the nearest 10. So we're going to find our tens place over here, which is a 0. But we don't panic. We just follow the same methodology. We say, okay, I'll look to the number to the right. And I say to myself, is it greater than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, it's smaller than 5. So if it's smaller than 5, I'm going to take it back down to 0. Giving me an answer of 5700. All I've done is brought the 2 down to a 0 here. So now let's look at the next one, 854 milliliters. Round it to the nearest 10. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to find the 10th position there. You're going to underline the number next to it. You're going to say, is it greater than 5, the number 4, or is it smaller than 5? It's smaller than 5, so I'm going to take it back down to 0. Giving me 850 milliliters. Now looking at my last one, 995 kilograms, rounded to the nearest 10. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to isolate where my tens number is there. I'm going to go along and I'm going to look at the number to the right of it. It's a 5. So I know I need to round up. So I need to add 1 to the tens place. Now when I add 1s to the tens place, I'm going to end up with a 0 because I'm going to end up with another 10, so I'm going to have to carry it forward. And if I do that, my answer is going to be 1000 kilograms, because you've got 995, okay, and you're rounding it up, so it's bigger than, it's equal to 5 or bigger, so you're going to round it up. You're going to add 1 there. So 99 add 1 will become 100, which is what that is there. And my 5 has become the 10. So it's 1000 kilograms. Now what we'll do briefly is we'll just dive straight on to rounding to the nearest 100. So let's briefly talk about rounding to the nearest 100. Okay, rounding to the nearest 100. Well, rounding to the nearest 100 is a similar format in rounding to the nearest 10. How's that, you might say? Well, rounding to the nearest 100 is going to be either 0, I'm going to take it to, or I'm going to take it to 100. Okay? There's going to be no in between when I'm rounding to the nearest 100. Just like rounding to the nearest 10 was between 0 and 10, rounding to the nearest 100 is between 0 and 100. So let's say I've got a number. I've got 628. Okay? And I ask you to round it to the nearest 100. How are you going to do it? Well, hopefully, I'm hoping you've got the understanding now. You're going to look for where your 100th place is, and you're going to box it off. There's my 100th place. I found it. So I'm going to look to the number to the right, and I'm going to say, is that number greater than 5 or smaller than 5? So I'm only interested in the number to the right of the number that I've boxed off. So it's a 2. Forget the 8. I'm not interested in 8. I'm interested in that 2. He's my best friend right now. And I'm going to say, are you greater than 5 or smaller than 5? You're smaller than 5. So what are we going to do? We're going to bring it back down to 0. And we're going to turn the 2 and an 8 into a 0 and a 0. And that's going to give us an answer of 600. So again, let's have a look at what I did. I was asked to round it to the nearest 100. I knew in my mind when I'm rounding to the nearest 100, I've got an option of 0 or 100. So I find my 100th position, which is the number 6. I boxed it off. I looked to the number to the right of it and said, are you bigger than 5 or smaller than 5? He replied, I'm smaller than 5. So he's a number 2. So what we're going to do, we're going to bring it down to 0. We're going to round down. So we get 600. Because we're rounding to the nearest 100. Now let's look at the examples. So regardless of the fact if they ask you to round to the nearest 100 kilograms, grams, milligrams, milliliters, millimoles, it don't matter as long as you've got your answer in the units that the question is asking for, and then you're going to do your rounding stage. So let's take a look. So we've got 9,979, oh sorry, it's gone a bit wonky, £9,979 and 20 pence, and they want us to round it to the nearest 100. So all we're going to do is find our 100 position. There you are, my friend. And we're going to look to the right of it, and we're going to say, are you bigger than 5 or are you smaller than 5? Well, the number 7 is bigger than 5, isn't it? So we're going to round up, and when you round up, you add 1 to the 100th position. So that should give you an answer of £10,000. Because you had £9,979. You looked at the 100 position there, looked to the number of the right of it, it was bigger than 5, so you rounded up, you added 1 to the 9. When you add 1 to the 9, it becomes obviously a 0. You add 1 to the next 9, that becomes a 0, and then the 1 goes there. So you end up with 10,000. Let's have a look at the next one. 988 milliliters. We're asked to round it to the nearest 100 milliliters. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to find our 100th position. We're going to look to the right of it, and we're going to say, are you greater than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, the number 8 is bigger than 5. So we're going to add 1 on to the 100th position, because we're going to round up. We're going up, remember? And that gives us an answer of 1,000 milliliters. Now looking at our last one, 449 milligrams. We're asked to round to the nearest 100 milligrams. What we're going to do, we're going to find and isolate where our 100th position is. We're going to look at the number to the right of it, which is a 4. So in the middle is a 4 next to our 100th position. Are you greater than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, you're smaller than 5. So what we're going to do, we're going to round down and make these 2 zeros and give us an answer of 400 milligrams. And that is the art to rounding when we're dealing with the nearest situations. So hopefully you've kind of grasped a bit of an understanding now that it's when you're dealing with rounding to decimal places, you're isolating what place it is that the question's referring to, so you're boxing it off. You're then looking to the number to the right of it, and then you're saying, are you bigger than 5, smaller than 5, or equal to 5? And then you're deciding what to do. When you're dealing with the nearest 10 and 100, it's very similar. You find that position, you look at the number to the right of it, and you say, are you bigger than 5 or smaller than 5? And then decide what you're going to do. If you're bigger than 5 or equal to 5, we're going to round up. If you're smaller than 5, we're going to round down. The difference really arises when we're dealing with rounding to the nearest 5. because when we were dealing with rounding to the nearest 5, we encountered that we could go 0, 5 or 10. So we had to make our little range of 0 to 5, 5 and then 5 to 10 and see where it slotted in. Right, so let's take a look at rounding to the nearest 0.1. So what I want to talk to you about here is that rounding to the nearest 0.1 is essentially about the decimal place. So if, for example, you've got a number line, let's say we've got 0.6782, where is the 0.1 place in this line? That's what you need to understand first of all. So it's here. We're talking about that position, and we want to round this to the nearest 0.1. So we're talking about that position there and rounding it to the nearest 0.1. So how do you do that? Well, you find and isolate that position first, and you look to the right of it, and you say, is that number greater than 5, equal to 5 or less than 5? And if it's equal to 5 or greater than 5, then we round up and we add 1, therefore giving us an answer of 0.7. So then what we're doing is, you see, we're cutting off the rest of it, and we're saying, right, it wants us to round it to the nearest 0.1, so we should only have one place after the decimal left in our answer. So it doesn't really matter when they ask you to round to the nearest 0.1 mil, or 1 gram, or 1 milligram, or 1 litre, or 0.1 millimolar to the nearest 0.1 millimolar. You're interested in this bit. You're interested in the 0.1, okay? And that's the bit you need to remember, because when you're doing your calculation questions, I talk a lot about in the workbook training videos that always get your units right at the end first. So if the answer wants the units in milliliters and we're calculating in litres, before you round it to the nearest 0.1, convert it to what the question wants, milliliters, and then do the rounding stage at the end if it asks you to round your answer at the end. So let's have a look at the examples I gave you and let's see how we did. So if you haven't done them, you can pause the video now after watching the tutorial and then you can have a go. So the first thing I'm going to do is to round here this number 3.72156 kilogram to the nearest 0.1 kilogram. I'm going to find that position for the 0.1. There it is. And I'm going to look to the right of it, and that's the only number I'm interested in. And I'm going to say, are you bigger than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, it's smaller than 5. So I'm going to round it down. I'm not going to include it, so I'm going to cross it out and leave my answer at 3.7. That's my answer to the nearest 0.1 kilogram. So let's take a look at the next answer. Sorry, next question. So we've got 665.56 milliliters, and we're asked to round it to the nearest 0.1 milliliter. Well, hopefully you should be isolating where that position is, the nearest 0.1 milliliter. You should be looking at the number to the right of it and saying, are you greater than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, it's bigger than 5. So we're going to round up. We're going to add 1 to that position, aren't we, to the 0.1 position. So that's going to give us an answer of 665.6 milliliters. Let's take a look at this one here. So we've got an infusion rate, let's say, of milliliters per hour that we've calculated in the calculations exam. And the last statement in the exam tells us that they want us to round this answer to the nearest 0.1 milliliters per hour. We've done all the hard work, we've got our calculation, we've got our answer. Now we're on the final step. So what we're going to do, we're going to highlight out where is our position for 0.1. We're going to look to the number to the right of it, and we're going to say, are you greater than 5 or smaller than 5? Well, you're greater than 5. So I'm going to round up, I'm going to add 1 to my 0.1 position. That gives me an answer of 7.9 milliliters per hour. So that's rounding to the nearest 0.1. Now let's take a look at rounding to the nearest 0.05. This is an interesting one actually. So I'm just going to cover it up and scroll up, and we'll just dive right into it. So, rounding to the nearest 0.05. Well, first of all, do you know where the 0.05 position actually is? Let's take a look. Let's say you've got a number here, and you've got 4.9632, I don't know, 796, okay? And you want to round that to the nearest 0.5. Well, first of all, you need to look for the 0.05 position, and that's there. Because look, if I write underneath it 0.05, can you see where the position is? It's there, isn't it? So what are you going to do here? Well, when you round to the nearest 0.05, you need to treat it like you were rounding earlier on in the training video to the nearest 5. So we don't look at the number to the right of it. When we're dealing with rounding to the nearest 5s, we employ a slightly different method. And you need to learn this and remember this, okay? I want you to remember that when you're dealing with rounding to the nearest 10, to the nearest 100, to the nearest 0.1, to the nearest 0.001, you always look at the number to the right of it, and then you decide which way you're going to round. But when you round to the nearest 5 or 0.5 or 0.05 or 0.00005, you want to use that method that we discussed earlier on. Let me find it. Here you go, I've got it. Can I use that line? Here's one I made earlier. Here we go. So when we were looking at rounding to the nearest 5 earlier, we said that when we're rounding to the nearest 5, it's got to be 0, 5 or 10. It's similar when we're rounding to the nearest 0.05, because we look at the number and we say, is that number in the 0.05 position, is it going to fall in this range? Is it 1 or 2 and we're going to round it down? Is it 3, 4 or 5 and we're going to round it to the 5? Is it a 5 and are we going to leave it? Because if it's 0.05, let's say it was 1.05, we would leave it alone, we wouldn't touch it. We'd say, right, we'll leave you alone because you've already got a 5 in that position. But if it's got a 6 or a 7 in that position, it's 0.06, we're going to bring it back down to 0.05. If it's got a 7 in that position, 0.07, we're going to bring it down to 0.05 position. If it's got an 8 in that position, so it's 0.08, we're going to round it up, aren't we? And make it a 10, so that'll give us 0.10. If there's a 9 in that position and we've got 0.09, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to say, look, 9 falls closer to the 10, so we're going to round it up. So really, that's what it's about. When you're dealing with the nearest 5, you need to be thinking about this bit here. Let's take a look at the questions and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. Best way to learn is always to do more examples. So that's why we've got this here. I'll try and make some time and load some more up on the Buy Me a Coffee page, which is absolutely free for this resource. I'll put it up for free for you all to have a go at. So first of all, when they ask you to round to the nearest 0.05, again, it doesn't really matter if they're asking you to round to the nearest 0.05 kilograms, 0.05 grams, 0.05 milligrams or 0.05 mils. You're interested in this bit right now. You're interested in the 0.05, okay? That's the bit that you want to take home from this. As long as you've got your units in the right format that the exam question is asking for, that's what you're interested in. If you haven't, you need to convert them to the right units, and that's very important. Probably sounded like a broken record a number of times I've said that on here today, but it's very important because the number of students who just don't remember to convert the units into the format that the question's asking for, it's quite shocking really. So because you're panicking, you can be stressed in the exam at times, and it's quite easy, I understand, to miss things, but really you don't want to be missing a mark where you don't have to. Every mark counts in that calculations exam. There's 40 questions. You just want to make sure that you hammer out every single question to the best of your ability and in the same methodical procedure. Be systematic with the way you work and you'll achieve it. So here we go. we're going to take a look at our number here. We've got 3.72156 kilogram. We want to round it to the nearest 0.05. What are we going to do? We're going to find that position. Where are you? There you are. If you can't see it, don't be afraid. Right underneath it, 0.05. Honestly, do that, and then you'll realise that's the position I should be looking at. And when I'm dealing with rounding to the nearest 5, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to picture in my head my little table. I'm going to picture this in my head, and I'm going to say, right, okay, this is a number 2 in that position. So where does it fall? Does it fall between the range of 0 and 5 or 5 and 10? It falls here between 0 and 5. Okay, between 0 and 5, what is 2 closer to? Is it closer to 0 or is it closer to 5? It's closer to 0. So what are you going to do? You're going to round that answer down. It's going to become 3.70 kilograms. So what we do is we ignore, first of all, this bit here, the 1 and the 5 and the 6. We're not interested in it. That's our best friend, the position of 0.05. And at that point, we're going to make you either go down to 0 or we're going to take you up to 5. But because you're closer to the 0, we bring you down to 0. Let's look at the next one. We've got 6.72156 grams. What are we going to do? Well, first of all, we're going to find our 0.05 position. There. And we're going to say, right, which one do you fall in? 0 to 5 or 5 to 10? Well, the number 2 falls in 0 to 5. Is it closer to 0 or is it closer to 5? Well, it's less than the midpoint, 2.5. So what you're going to do, you're going to round it down. So you're going to cross out that, you're not interested in that, and you're going to bring it down to 6.70 grams. Because that's the position to the nearest 0.05, guys. That's what we're doing. So let's carry on. We've got, where are we? We're here. 0.1157 kilogram. So what are we going to do? We're going to look for the 0.05 position, which is that one. If you can't see it, don't worry. Again, write it underneath. There's no harm. You know, you've got scrap paper in the exam, ask for it, write it out, work through it. So we've got a 1 in the 0.05 position there. A 1 there. What we're going to do, we're going to say you fall in here between 0 and 5. You're less than the midpoint, so we're going to round down. So that answer is going to become 0.10 kilograms. And we move on to our next question. And we want to round this to the nearest 0.05. So round it to the nearest 0.05. So find your position for the 0.05. It's that one there. You're going to say, where do you fall in? Which range? Well, number 4 is in the 0.05 position. So the number 4 falls between 0 and 5. And the number 4 is greater than the midpoint, 2.5. So it's closer to 5 here. So what are we going to do? We're going to bring it up to 5. So we're going to cross out the other numbers we're not interested in. And we're going to write 7.95 milligrams. Because we've taken that 4 up to a 5, because we're rounding to the nearest 0.05. So we're rounding to the nearest 5 in that position. The last one, we've got 0.671 grams. So what we're going to do, we're going to look for our 0.05 position, which is there. And we're going to say, okay, is 7, which one are you going to put it in? Well, hopefully you're going to put it in the 5 to 10 range, 7. And this is the interesting bit. With 7, it's less than the midpoint, is 7. So 7's going to be rounded closer to the 5, so we're going to take it to 5 over here. So that would make our answer here 0.65 grams. Okay, so hopefully I hope you've enjoyed this rounding video, part 1, which is covering scenarios where at the end of the calculations question it asks you to round your answer. One thing I will say to you is that if you've enjoyed the way I teach, if you've understood the way I teach, then please take a look at my Buy Me a Coffee page. On there it's got some further workshops on calculation training packages. Some of them are free, some of them I charge for, the ones that I've put together. So you're more than welcome to have a browse through. Any questions, just drop me an email. My email address is on there as well. It's on here, azza.iqbal, numerical number 4 at nhs.net. So just to wrap up before we finish, I want to talk to you a little bit about quantity to supply scenarios. Okay, so as a pharmacy student, this is pretty important because on the calculations exam, you're gonna get at some point a quantity to supply scenario. And in these scenarios, the rules can differ when it comes to rounding. So I'm not going to go through it fully today because it's going to take a whole lot of different learning as this one. So what I did want to just talk to you briefly about was this bit here that some students get confused about. So when you're dealing with quantity to supply and you're dealing with antibiotic bottles, let's have a look at a scenario here. So when dealing with antibiotic situations, you need to know that you need to round up to the nearest bottle, as you must supply enough medication to complete the course. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, look, if you've got a calculation and you work out that the quantity that they need for that calculation, because they give you a prescription and they say work it out, how much does the child need, and your calculation comes to 2.8 bottles. Yeah, and the question's asking you, look at the question, make sure you read the question, how many bottles should be supplied? Well, in this scenario here, you need to know that the answer, you're going to have to round up. You're going to have to give 3 bottles here in this situation. Because you can't give 2.8 bottles, okay? 2.8 bottles don't exist. And the question isn't asking you to round, in that wording saying round it, but it is saying how many bottles would you supply. So you would round it in this scenario, okay? Normally what we say in the exam is if the question doesn't tell you to round the answer, don't round the answer, just give the answer as it is. However, when you're dealing with antibiotic situations, you need to have that common sense understanding to say, hold on a minute, I can't give 2.8 bottles, I'm going to round it. Another example of this that you come across actually in practice quite often is with dental prescriptions or acute antibiotic prescriptions for children. So it's this one here where when you do a calculation, let's say for amoxicillin suspension as an example, and you calculate that they need 110 mils of liquid for the course of antibiotic, but the question actually asks, the question states in the question, how many bottles should be supplied? The original bottle size is 100 mil. The question's actually saying to you, look, how many bottles should be supplied? And they're telling you what the original pack size of the bottle is. So you're not going to say, oh yeah, it's 110 mils, I'm going to round down. This is a different situation. This is dealing with an antibiotic. So you're going to have to supply 2 bottles here. 2 bottles. Why would you give 2 bottles of 100 mil? Well, if you only gave 1 bottle of 100 mil, that child would miss their dose, that 10 mils that they still need. So we always give enough to complete the course. So you give it to the nearest pack size because they've told you in the question. They're asking you how many bottles should you give. Another scenario that you might come across is vials and ampules. So you might be asked to do a calculation and at the end, read the question. Again, I can't state this enough. Read the question carefully. If the question says, how many vials should you supply? How many vials? How many ampules? Okay? In these scenarios, you must round it to the full quantity of an ampule or a vial. Let me show you an example. So potassium chloride is available as 5 ml ampules. How many potassium chloride 20% weight in volume ampules are required to prepare this infusion? You calculate, after doing your calculation, that they need 13.9 mils of the solution for infusion. Okay, so they need 13.9 mils of this potassium chloride infusion. That's not the answer. It's asking how many ampules are required, and it comes as a 5 ml ampule. So you would need 3 ampules of 5 ml, because you're going to have to give that patient 13.9 mils. So you would have to supply a total of 15 mils in those ampules. If you provided 2 ampules, then you're only giving them 10 mils, and you're not actually giving them enough that they need for that treatment course. So this answer would actually be 3 ampules. So these are a few exceptions to the rules when it comes to rounding that you need to be aware of. The other thing that I was talking about was that in quantity to supply calculations, there are times where you need to round up at midpoint during the calculation. For example, in some of the tablet scenarios, or if the syringe is graduated in so many increments. But again, don't get too hung up on that. That's very rare type of calculation. It's only in quantity to supply calculations where, for example, when you've calculated a total number that you need during that calculation in terms of milligrams or grams, you might have to take things like this into account. But again, I'll be covering that in the quantity to supply workbook, or alternatively, keep practicing your past exam questions and hopefully you'll come across that scenario. So again, I hope you've enjoyed this session, and do give it a like, and also take a look on my Buy Me a Coffee page.